Hi there, and welcome to another episode of the Future of Jewish podcast. I'm your host, Joshua Hoffman. On this episode, I am joined by Laureen Lipsky. She is the CEO and founder of Taking Back the Narrative, a Zionist education initiative. Her Israel and Jewish-oriented op-ed writing has been featured in the Federalist, American Thinker, Washington Examiner, Algemeiner, Israel Hayom, and Jewish News Syndicate. Enjoy my conversation with Laureen Lipsky. Laureen, thank you so much for taking the time to join me today. I really appreciate you taking the time, and I'm really excited for this conversation because you and I have talked many times off the air, so to speak, and finally we get to do it on the record. Before we get into the great stuff that you're working on today, why don't you give us a peek behind the corner of, where you're from, everything that led to where you are today?
There are, I guess, two versions of what I can tell you. The short version, I'm a born-again Zionist. A little bit longer version. So I'm the CEO and founder of Taking Back the Narrative, a Zionism education initiative. And how I got into it, a bit of a process. So I didn't even know I was Jewish until I was about 7, 8 years old. Found out, was not allowed to go to Hebrew school. My father did not like the local rabbi for a multitude of reasons. But luckily, when I was nearing bat mitzvah age, my parents decided to, quote unquote, rent a rabbi, as if you rent a car. And we headed over to Israel. I went up to the Masada, had a beautiful ceremony, transliterated because I didn't know a word of Hebrew at the time. And I was a Zionist, I loved Israel. It was my first international trip. I fell in love with the land, not understanding why I'm falling in love with the land, but I did. And I was pro-Israel, but then unfortunately, for about 20 years, I was fairly anti-Israel because of the media, because of other influences, a lot of, I would call it misguided terminology. And so 2014 was my aha moment. And it was the first Hamas war, and watching CNN, reading the New York Times made me question what the information was that was coming in. And I saw, at the time, I only had a few friends from Israel on Facebook. So I saw what they were posting did not match what I was seeing on television or in the print. So I just started posting about Israel, like one fact per week, one fact per day, turned into basically a career. I was more interested in sharing the truth about Israel than my actual paying job at the time. And so about a year ago, I started Taking Back the Narrative. It's an initiative for everyone, for Jews, Christians, Muslims, people of all ages. And it's to fill in the historical gap between biblical time and 1948. It's a very big time span that not a lot of organizations focus on. So I thought, to really understand the Israel correct narrative, it's important to fill in those blanks. And it's what helped me return back to Zionism.
Very interesting. So a lot to unpack there. First, I want to go back to what you initially said, which is you found out you were Jewish when you were 7 or 8 years old. Do you remember the moment? Like, can you take us back to your 7 or 8-year-old self and what you were thinking and feeling when you found this out?
Absolutely. And I hope I'm not repeating myself if we talked about this off record. So yes, absolutely. There was a show in America called Lassie. I'm dating myself for those who know the show. It was popular in the, I guess, in the 80s, right? Or at least the reruns were. And so yes, there was the main character, little Timmy, and he had a dog named Lassie. And, it was a white Christian family. And every night before bed, he would cross himself and pray to Jesus. When you're 7 years old, you're very impressionable. And so I thought all children across America, kneel down on their knees and cross themselves and pray to Jesus. And that's what I was doing for a good, I would say, 2-3 weeks. One day, my dad walks by my bedroom, sees that I'm crossing myself, saying something about Jesus. And he stops, looks at me, and he says to me, "We need to have a conversation." And I'm utterly confused, right? Like, why is he interrupting my nightly prayer? But then when I learned that I was Jewish, I was fascinated and I wanted to learn everything there was about Jewish people. I was obsessed with Jewish last names that I would see on TV. So it was a complete 180 that I did once I found out.
And so, how does your Jewish identity evolve from there?
It was a struggle, right? Because my parents came from a former Soviet Union republic from Belarus. Their Jewish identity, unfortunately, was had to be, non-existent, for them to function in society. And I know that obviously, the Hasidic Jews, they did such a great job throughout the years to keep that Jewish flame alive. But if you were not born into that community, it was virtually impossible, right? So my parents got married in a civil ceremony, not in a religious ceremony. My parents said that they grew up underground celebrating, like Pesach, and basically that's it. I think that was the only holiday that my grandparents like allowed them to do, but they didn't have any religious connotation. So when they came to America 3 years before I was born, they were so busy just setting up their lives, trying to scrape up enough money to live, that they didn't really think, oh, now that we have children, let's get them a religious education, because they didn't have one themselves. So again, like once I found out that I was Jewish, I begged my parents to send me to Hebrew school because my town was half Italian, half Jewish. So your friends either go to CCD for the Catholic kids or they go to Hebrew school. By having escaped communism, my parents were very sensitive to politics of certain rabbis, and we luckily now we have Chabad in that community, but at that time we only had one synagogue, and the rabbi happened to be a little bit more left leaning. Didn't So my dad did not agree with his style, so to say. So that's it. There's only so much you can do when you're a child, right? You can't really go against your parents. So my childhood, it was just very cultural, right? I would have these holiday dinners with my grandparents, but nothing was explained. Up until a few years ago, I didn't even know half of the holidays. Like I didn't know about Purim until probably a good maybe 7, 8 years ago. I had no idea about Tisha B'Av, one of the most sacred holidays of the Jewish calendar. What else did I not know about? I think one family in our town observed maybe Sukkot, but to me it was always funny, right? Like, why do they have a hut in their backyard? So it was a constant, gradual evolvement. And even when I moved to New York City, right? I mean, at the height, we had 2 million Jews living here before the pandemic. And even then, like I thought of myself as this like waspy girl, and I joined the junior league, and I didn't have any Jewish friends, which is shocking for someone Jewish in New York City. So to me, I would say it was not until I became a Zionist, a vocal one, that I really dialed in to my Jewish identity, right? So a lot of my friends now are Jewish. I would say most of my friends now are Jewish. Uh, a quarter of them are religious. So I'm learning so much, and it like I feel like I'm back home, right? Like a return back to my roots on so many levels.
Talk to me about the conversations or lack thereof about Israel during your childhood. I mean, did your parents talk to you and your grandparents about Israel at all, about Zionism?
It's interesting you asked that, because my grandparents were actually super Zionists, right? They were Holocaust survivors. My grandfather's family all were murdered in Ukraine, actually not by Nazis, but by Ukrainian nationals. Well, at the time it was Poland, but now it's Ukraine. It was in Lvov, and only one of his siblings survived, and he survived by joining Batar. I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce it in Hebrew properly. And he had escaped from the last boat out of Vienna into Israel, right? And so my grandfather didn't have any contact with his brother for decades and decades. And I think he only found out he had survived through secret communication. Like I think my mom had said that there was some religious man who would come by and give a note a couple times, like, or once a year. And that's how he knew where his brother had been living in Israel. So growing up, my paternal grandmother lived in Netanya. So, we knew that she lived there. We worried about her when there was issues, like in the region. I know that every year my parents financially supported AFMDA. For those who don't know, that's the American Friends of Magen David Adom. So I saw little parcels of Israel, right? And my parents were not anti-Israel like, at all, but it was not something that we discussed. It was something just on the periphery, right? Like every once a year, you saw that envelope for AFMDA. Maybe once a month, I would talk to my grandmother in Netanya in very broken Russian on my part. She spoke fluent Russian. So again, like it wasn't until I got into Zionism that my parents were displaying their proud Zionism voices, right? Like it was only a couple of years ago I found out that my father back in Belarus had a secret underground Zionist club that was raided by the KGB. And all of the members ended up in prison except for my dad. And the only reason he escaped that fate is because he had a family funeral and just happened to not be there at the time of the raid. So it's interesting, right? So, someone can be even not anti-Israel, but if it's not talked about at home, especially growing up, then it doesn't become part of the forefront of the cultural experience.
So taking back the narrative is about a year old officially. I know you've been involved sort of in unofficial Israel advocacy for much longer, but what have been some of the feedback or reactions that you've gotten in the last year or so with taking back the narrative?
Interestingly enough, I've gotten the most positive feedback from Muslims from around the world. So there's the website, tbtnisrael.com. That's where all the information is, right? We have topics ranging from who are the Palestinians to the British occupation, Jordanian occupation, Ottoman Empire, Judea and Samaria, and a plethora of other topics. Jewish diversity. We keep things positive, of course, right? I mean, there are great organizations that tackle anti-Semitism. I'm not in that space. I like to. I think having the correct narrative on Zionism does combat anti-Semitism, but I'm not here to, talk about this anti-Semite and that anti-Semite, and this group did this to the Jews and that group did that to the Jews. And I know that there's a lot of diversity in Israel, not just Jews, and even Muslim Arabs contribute positively to society, right? Like every group does, like the Circassian Muslims and of course the Druze and the Bedouins, right? Like everyone has something to contribute to that, to that country. But surprisingly and unsurprisingly, yeah, it's the Muslim Zionists who are flocking to the social media site that I have on Instagram, on Twitter, and a lot of them privately message me, and I'll get messages from Bangladesh, which I had no idea there was a single pro-Israel person there, right? Just how it's portrayed, like they all hate Israel. But I'm not saying that most love Israel there, but it's a growing number. I've had communication with people from Iraq, and I respond the same way. I said, wow, like, thank you so much. I had no idea there was support for Israel in Iraq. And the person had said to me, oh, you would be surprised. It's just that Iran is controlling our government. So we just are afraid to be more vocal, but this support is there. Messages from Morocco, more and more from Egypt. I had this man who actually was sending me hate messages for years. And suddenly he created a pro-Israel Egyptian account. And he said he had taken a lot of information from my website. And he apologized and said, oh, I hope you don't mind me stealing information. I said, not at all. If it helps fellow Muslims in your country, then they can go right ahead. So yeah, so I think that was the most surprising and the most encouraging. I truthfully have had a lot of pushback from fellow Jews. Not all, of course. I mean, of course, there's been a lot of support from the Jewish community, but there's also been pushback in terms of terminology, discrepancy on terminology. There's been pushback of, oh, there's so many Jewish groups that exist, so many Jewish organizations. why you're creating another one. And then I explained why. And some people, some people don't want, not to say competition, because we're all doing our best in various ways. But
But
I
let's talk
feel,
about that for a second, because that's
yeah.
interesting. What is your reply when people say, why do we need another Jewish organization?
So my short reply is that I had been involved in a lot of organizations. I mean, now I'm whittled down to 3, but at the height, I was probably involved in 9 or 10, as a donor, as a member. And I said, and so, before I started taking back the narrative, you don't just wake up one day, and it's probably for you too, right? Before you created Future of Jewish, you probably didn't just wake up one day and thinking, okay, I'm going to create an initiative, right? Like, you want to do some market research, you want to see what's missing out there, you want to see if your initiative is needed, right? Like, if there's a need for your quote unquote product, right? And so I was talking to a lot of people who maybe were pro-Israel, but they wanted help. Like, okay, so when I go online and I see the slew of anti-Semitism, how do I push back? I don't know where to go to. Like, I go to this organization's website, they don't share that information. I go to that person's, that organization's website, that there's nothing for me to share. And so I know for myself, again, like filling in those gap, that historical quote unquote gap of 2000 years, helped me really shift my perspective, right? Like, on Israel, on Zionism, and even on Jews. So that's what I say. I say that, your organization is doing great work, but I'm filling in that 2000-year gap. And I'm also focusing in on the terminology that's needed to understand reality on the ground, right? And either they want to work with me, I can tell you off record about an organization that will be working with me. And then there are others who pass, and that's fine, right? Like, again, like, I think there is a need for all organizations. I'm just staying in my lane, and that's it.
Right, that's fair. So, you mentioned, what do you respond with, when there's a slew of anti-Semitism? How do I push back? Right, those are your words that it just wrote
Right.
down to ask you. So, I'm wondering, especially anti-Semitism that's online, social media, digital media, so on and so forth. Uh, I'm wondering if there's even a need to push back, because it seems to me that sort of the pushback gives credibility to the person, the perpetrator, if you will. And so I'm just wondering, how you look at dealing with online anti-Semitism, in terms of, do you push back at all? If you do, how do you do it? Why do you do it? So on and so forth.
That's an excellent question, and I would love to unpack that in 2 ways, right? So one, it's the notion of hasbara, right? That a lot of Israelis balk at, and actually agree, right? Because I used to think like, oh, hasbara is the best thing ever, but it's not. So in a way, and again, it depends how you use that word, right? So defending Israel or being an Israel advocate is something I don't say anymore, right? Because hasbara, defending Israel, being an advocate for something, and I worked in PR after college for a year. You do that when you need to, when something is wrong and you need to fix it, right? And so Israel is on the right side of history. And then, of course, like, all countries have problems and issues, right? Like, that's a given. And we talked about this offline, before that, it's a double standard that, only Israel is expected to be perfect and all other countries can make mistakes. But so to me, I'm in the business of educating, right? And so to me, when I go online, I don't see a lot of like, oh, I hate Jews, all of them like must die. That's old school anti-Semitism. The new school of anti-Semitism, and when I say new, probably a couple decades at this point, especially as of late, it's anti-Zionism, right? Like, anti-Semitic anti-Zionism. So the biggest lie out there, and you see this everywhere, and it's just recycled and recycled, and it fuels the hate for Jews, and it ends up in attacks on Jews, even here in New York City, right? Like, there were Hamas rallies, ended up in assaults on Jews, and not to mention all the terrorism attacks that have happened in Israel, right? So the biggest lie that had been perpetrated, is still being perpetrated, is that, Jews left Israel, all of them, 2,000 years ago. The Arabs came in, and Jews just returned as victims of the Holocaust after World War II, right? And that's the lie that I believed for all those years. And so people say, well, like, if you left a country and another people came in, then you're occupying the country, you're stealing the land, and on and on and on, right? So the best way to push back, again, it's filling in that gap, right? Saying, like, well, actually, Jews have had a continuous presence. Talking about the Jews of Pekin, talking about the four holy cities, talking about, the Battle of Haifa of 1100, right? Like, the Jews and Muslims uh, defended Haifa, against the Crusaders. And when historians went back to look at the records, they realized it actually was mostly Jews, right? Not a lot of Muslims. You're talking about the different aliyot, right? The Yemenites, who their first aliyot was in the late, actually, 1600s. The Kurdish aliyah. People think of Israel, those who, are anti-Israel, they think of Israel as a what? Just white Europeans, right? We're not even white. And I know that my Mizrahi friends, their families never stepped foot in Europe. I mean, now on vacation, but like that back then did not. And so many people don't even know that there's such a thing as Mizrahi Jews. And you'd be surprised. I have a Jewish neighbor, and I had mentioned the word Mizrahi to him about a year ago, and he said, "What's that?" Right? And he's Jewish. He had no idea. He'd been to Israel, right? Israel's 60% Jewish. So I think it's that education that really. I'm not saying that someone who is a virulent anti-Israel hater is suddenly going to change their mind, but putting that information out there, so maybe they won't change their mind, but maybe someone reading that comment will. Maybe someone else will have that aha moment. You just never know. And I feel like if we as Jews don't push back with facts, then those who hate us fill it in with lies, right? And I think it's the most effective thing to do.
I've been following you on LinkedIn for quite a while now, and sometimes I feel that some of your posts are a bit aggressive. I would say. I think I saw one post where you called Joe Biden, president of the U.S., Jihad Joe, which I would consider to be name calling. Whether or not the name is or the nickname is accurate or not accurate, I'm not here to argue that. I just don't know if name calling is effective, and I'm just wondering if you could, share with us why you think that that form of communication is effective as the founder and CEO of Taking Back the Narrative, because to me, you're the prime example of how to communicate, how to take back the narrative, how to engage in effective, productive dialogue on the internet and off the internet. And I'm just wondering, like, when I saw that, for me, that was a big turnoff for me personally. It's just not my style. I don't think name calling people, no matter who they are, what they've done, is an effective way of, in this case, quote unquote, taking back the narrative. And I'm just curious, for people that also follow you on LinkedIn or will follow you in the future and might see that kind of behavior, if you will, from you, why they would then consider you to be, a credible and trustworthy individual for taking back Israel and Zionist narrative.
Okay, so I take a very strong stance on not silencing abuse, right? So, for example, LinkedIn. So for 4 years, I have seen professionals across the board, from all different sectors, bash Trump, make up lies about Trump, call him names. There was no pushback, right? And so finally, Republicans, and I make no, I don't make any excuses for my politics. It's just that I think we need to separate who we are as individuals and like what we do professionally, right? So I have a professional page, Taking Back the Narrative, on LinkedIn that has no politics there. My personal quote unquote, page, I do post about politics. I post about anti-Semitism. I post about Zionism. A lot of times they're interlinked, right? So, for example, Biden's trip to Israel had a lot of anti-Semitic components to it, right? Like the plan for putting in basically a terrorist consulate in Jerusalem is not seen as something pro-Israel. What he's trying to do in Judea and Samaria, which is very much part of Israel, is also seen by many to be anti-Semitic. To address your claim of calling him names, so Biden has had a decades-long history of anti-Semitism. So in 1982, I'm sure you know what he said to then Prime Minister Begin, cutting off aid to Israel. It prompted Begin at the time to craft his most famous speech, right? I'm not a Jew, with on begging knees, right? And then he was anti-Semitic, as a cohort to Obama. All of his.
I'm not arguing the facts or the history. I'm wondering
Right.
if it's effective to be name calling people and to be communicating in certain ways that ultimately either give us more of a bad name, us as the Jews, or just otherwise do not provide an effective and productive form of debate and argument in order to achieve what we want to achieve, which in the case of your organization is taking back the narrative. So, the idea of writing down a list of facts is nice, but that's not my point. My point is name calling and other, what I would call overly aggressive tactics, an effective and productive way of trying to achieve your organization's mission.
So again, my personal LinkedIn is not connected, right? So all businesses have separate pages, right? So again, like for 4 years, people who ran companies had no problems stating their political views, their personal views, and meld it together. But then they had their business pages where there was no politics. That's the trend on LinkedIn, right? And so I hold steadfast. I'm not trying to change anyone's mind in terms of politics. Those are freedoms of expression, and that actually comes from censorship, right? So things that I could post on Facebook in the past, so Facebook, shadow bans. LinkedIn did not shadow ban until about, I would say, like a year or two ago. And so I've seen that shift of other people who support Israel, who are Zionist leaders themselves. They post pro-Israel posts on LinkedIn. They post their political viewpoints, and it's fine, right? And so I don't go out of my way to, as you say, call someone a name only when it warrants, right? So, if something, let's say Biden does that I don't agree with, that warrants that kind of name, I'll use it. If it doesn't, then I don't. And I think, we live in such a PC offended culture. We need to push back on it, right? Because if we're going to allow people to dictate out what we put out there, who are so offended by it, but then, those same people post things that, we're, the other side, quote unquote, is offended by, that's how we get to where we are right now, right? So, if you go to Taking Back the Narrative's website, there's no politics there, because I do believe that, Israel should not be a right issue, a left issue at all, right? Like I think it should not even be involved in those two parties, like it was decades ago. But I think to single out people because of what they post on social media, it's not conducive to freedom of expression.
Yeah, no, I understand that. And I'm not telling anyone to censor themselves, but one of the things that I've been highly critical of the Jewish world in general is that, you have all these organizations, many of which, unlike yours, have been around for decades, several years. You also have new upstarts like Taking Back the Narrative. And basically in both of those groups, I mean, there's a clear lack of personal brand recognition, meaning, and I think you and I have talked about this, meaning that, most people don't know who the top brass is at these organizations, CEO, CMO, whatever. And, you might say, well, why do you need to know? And I would say, well, in today's day and age, where your favorite brands, whether it be online brands or retail brands or whatever, you can probably name their CEO. You might even be following them on social media. I mean, there was a statistic I remember from several years ago, maybe back in 2013, where it said that CEOs of companies that tweet, customers are 50% more likely to buy products from their company. I mean, that's a real thing. And so being the face of an organization, for-profit, nonprofit, private sector, nonprofit sector, is important for the sake of moving that organization forward. Now, everyone is entitled to their own beliefs and attitudes and perspectives and thoughts. Again, I'm not advocating for censorship, but I'm just wondering for two reasons. One, because if you are going to be successful in the Jewish world, I think you're going to have to be the face of your own organization, and you're going to have to be out there. And I think you already have been out there, which I think is great. But the second side of that means behaving in such a way that is conducive to, achieving the mission of your organization. And I'm just wondering if name calling people, whether or not it's justified, as you said, is effective. I personally don't think it is. To that, you say what?
It has not been a drawback at all. And I'll give you an example. So my social media intern for the spring, progressive, super progressive. And he, again, we had a frank discussion about my political views. He knew exactly what I was posting on my personal LinkedIn page, not on my Taking Back the Narrative page. He had no problem. In fact, he told all of his fraternity to tune in to the posts of Taking Back the Narrative. I have people on my at TVTN Israel Instagram account. Many of them are liberals. Like many of them post things, that are pro-Democrat. So I think that when you put out competent information, it truly does not matter what the political viewpoints are. Like I'll tell you, like I follow accounts that are clearly Democrat, and I know that in the past they've called, Trump names and this and that, but I don't care. Like what matters to me is, are they putting out accurate information about Israel? Are they putting out relevant information? And are they helping to take back the narrative, right? So I think we're living in the world now, like, and I know you have one perspective, but I've seen another perspective that I think now people are smart enough to understand people have their personal views about something. But if the product that they put out or the initiative that they run, has, relevant information, is moving, like you said, like the conversation forward, you can have both, right? We live in this age where the two can exist together.
Right. So, okay. On that note, I wanted to ask you, I think you and I have also talked about this off the air, the difference between being smart and being right. I mean, running Izzy, which is my first real startup for the last 2 years, I would say that's my number one lesson that I've learned is the difference between being right, being righteous, and being smart, being strategic. And, a lot of people in the Hasbara / Israel advocacy / pro-Israel spaces are so focused on being right that sometimes they don't realize that they're not being effective. They're not being strategic enough. And so I'm not saying hide the facts or sugarcoat the facts or, anything of that nature. I guess what I'm saying is maybe people would be more willing to listen. Maybe people would be more willing to digest some of this information or content or whatever it may be. If we, in general, took a more strategic, more smart approach as opposed to a more right or righteous approach. Of course, if you can achieve both at the same time, that's a perfect world, but sometimes you kind of have to lean toward one or the other. And I'm just wondering, what your thoughts are on that sort of breakdown.
I absolutely agree. So I did both for Taking Back the Narrative, and it's a conversation, internal one that I had with myself, right? Because going back to what I said about portraying all the non-Jewish groups living in Israel, I could have gone the path of, this group does this to Jews and this group does this, we hear and see in the media, you live in Israel, you live it, right? I made a strategic decision that I stand by not to do that, right? And I've gotten pushback actually from obviously other Jews, and they say like, oh, like how can you say positive things about this group and that group when you know that there's so many issues in that community towards Jews? I said, but they're not all like that, right? So first of all, this initiative is pro-Arab. I'm pro-Muslim. I just came back from the UAE a couple months ago. It was a transformative trip. I obviously, and I pushed back, like speaking of pushing back, there's some people who say like, oh, all Muslims are evil, or, we can't work with the Arabs. And that's not true, right? Like, I think that we, first of all, culturally have more in common with the Arabs. there's nothing going on in the Gulf, well, except for Qatar and Kuwait, but we see with the Abraham Accords, there's a lot of positivity there. I mean, Israel has a better relationship with the UAE than most of Europe has with Israel. So that strategic decision I made, not to go down that anti-Semitic blaming route within my information that I share. Again, there are many organizations that deal with pointing out who the anti-Semites are and pointing out almost the near daily anti-Semitic attacks that happen, unfortunately, in this world. I decided not to be part of that. So what I do, I just share facts, and it's been great. Like, I actually have gotten, like I said, like a lot of feedback, a lot of positive feedback from Muslims, from Christians, from Jews that were lapsed, Jews who themselves had not really thought much about Israel, or who had, like me, grown up on a diet of false information. And it's that right balance, right? And also, like, I think that new leadership, I call it new, right? Because this is not some mega organization, it never will be. So I understand, like, people who helm those types of organizations, they have one set of principles that they need to be by. And I've had off-record conversations with, those organizations. They say, like, oh, like, I wish I could share this information, but my board prevents me. Or, like, I wish I could do that, and my board says no. And I'm in a unique position with Taking Back the Narrative, is that I have an advisory committee, but we are on the same page, and it's not a nonprofit, it's an LLC. So I can choose, who to work with, collaborate together with. And it just knowing, the right steps to take. So again, like I like to say, I present the information on a platter. Those who want to sample the platter, they're welcome to. And if those who find issues with the facts that Taking Back the Narrative shares, that's fine too. I'm not, Taking Back the Narrative is not trying to please everyone. It's just sharing facts, and that's that, right? Like, you can't argue with history.
No, I appreciate that. Talk to me about 2 or 3 of the most under-discussed and incredibly important narratives that you think we should be taking back.
Absolutely, it's Judea and Samaria, right? Like, I think it's this elephant in the room that most Jews, like, don't. Well, I think that there's a spectrum, right? There's Jews who only talk about Judea and Samaria and don't focus on the rest of Israel. And then I would say that's maybe 10%. And then 90%, like, they'll say, like, Tel Aviv, Tel Aviv, Tel Aviv, right? Like, Tel Aviv is not the ancestral heartland of Israel, not even the capital of Israel. And they seem to, and like I did, like, I was guilty of this too, right? Like, I remember thinking, I'll tell you a story. I was in Hebron, 2018, with a Chabad JLI trip. And before going there, and again, I had become a Zionist in 2014. So this is 4 years into me being a Zionist, right? Like, into posting information, this, and that. And I'm thinking, why is Israel holding on to Hebron, right? I mean, only 3% of Hebron is Jewish. I had been on this bulletproof bus to get there, right? Like, I had to wake up very early in the morning. I think it was like 4 a.m. to get there. And I saw this onslaught of military personnel there, like, with guns I had never seen before, like the size of these weapons. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, how much money is Israel spending to keep how many Jews, like, safe, right? Like, why not just, why are we holding on to this, right? Like, what's the importance of this? So mind you, I'm secular. I, at that point, had never been to Hebron, but going there, going on a tour and understanding the significance of Hebron, not only religiously, but also geographically, historically, then I got it. Like, then I understood. And it's how I felt when I was sitting on the hills of Judea and Samaria, right? Like, suddenly I felt this surge of our ancestors, right? Like, basically entering my bloodstream. Like, all of a sudden, like, I'm feeling the shepherds and the warriors and the farmers who had stood on those hills for thousands of years, in the past. So I absolutely think Judea and Samaria needs to be part of the narrative. I also think another narrative that's missed is only focusing on Israel without focusing on Israel within the Middle East. I think it's very important to understand the entire region and how it relates to Israel and how Israel relates to other parts of the Middle East. Absolutely. And then a third narrative, I would say, is, and I know that this could be controversial to some of the listeners, maybe to you, but it's how we address the Palestinians, right? I grew up thinking that they were a distinct ethnicity. They are not. They were invented by the KGB in 1967. Those are the facts. And so what I say to people, and like, what I post about, it was actually one of my more popular posts. Which Palestinians are you talking about? Are you talking about the Gazans? Are you talking about the Israeli Arab Muslims? Are you talking about the Israeli Arab Christians? Are you talking about the Muslims? Are you talking about the Arabs in Judea and Samaria that were resettled by Jordan and they're Jordanians, right? Like during the Jordanian occupation? Are you talking about the Arabs that were resettled into the region by the Ottoman Empire, then more so imported through the British, occupation? Or are you talking about the Jewish clans that were forcibly converted under the Ottoman Empire that live as Arab Muslims, right? So there are these seven, and also the Bedouins, right? And so Mohammed Kabia, who's my favorite Muslim Zionist, I'm sure you know of him or even know him personally, maybe. He was so offended by Amnesty International's anti-Semitic report that came out recently that, gave a scathing rebuke, against Israel. And Muhammad said, "How dare they call me a Palestinian? I'm a proud Bedouin. So you're erasing my family's thousands of year heritage." And that's true. So what it does, it not only erases Jewish heritage, our heritage, by saying Palestinians, because Jews were called Palestinians for thousands of years. It's also erasing Arab heritage too. Like, if you talk to a lot of Arabs, they'll say like, yes, like my family is in Israel, but my great great grandparents, are from Tunisia or from Iraq or from Morocco. So I think we need to focus on those aspects as well.
So let's talk about the whole KGB thing, because that's something that is pretty new on my radar. Can you
Oh, really? Yeah.
name the sources of that information, how you came about it, a little bit more about it? What can you share with us on that front?
Yeah, so I first heard about it actually from my father, who grew up in Russia, and I heard snippets of it growing up, but I never really explored it. And then there was this great webinar, and it's online also. That there's a lot of documents out there that you can find actually quite easily. By To me, what really cemented it was Colonel Richard Kemp did this incredible webinar with Emmett. For those who don't know, Emmett is an it's a lobbying organization here in the States in DC. He spoke for 90 minutes, and I have 3 pages filled with notes as to why the KGB created the Palestinians, how they went about doing it, and why it has been the most successful lie almost in the history of the world. So what happened is that not many people, like I didn't know this either until recently. So Russia, or the Soviet Union at that point, as it was called, was the first to recognize Israel. It wasn't America, it was the USSR. And why did they do that? Because the USSR, had been historically anti-Semitic. So one would think, why would they? Why would they be so eager to recognize Israel internationally? Well, they did so because they were hoping Israel would become a communist vassal state, right? Just were looking for allies, right? The Cold War was beginning at that point. They wanted to counter the US. Well, 2 things happened on that front. Jews at that point who were living in Israel were beginning to learn about the crimes of communism and, and all the anti-Semitism that was going on in Russia, and they were not having it. So they pushed back against becoming a vassal state. And then it was the War of 67. So famously, the USSR backed the Arab armies, financially, backed them with weapons, and Israel dared to win that war, right? Like, how dare this ragtag team of Jews beat back our 6 armies that we basically unleashed against Israel? and that was it. So they had an anti-Semitic hissy fit, and they recruited Arafat, who was not even like a major player. He hadn't been. He had created the PLO in '64. They recruited Abbas. Abbas actually was an agent in Lebanon. They trained both in camps and KGB camps in Russia. There's photo evidence of their KGB names, documents, everything is there. So what they did, they had about 4,000 KGB agents, many of whom were Arab, who spread anti-Semitic lies against Israel and against Jews around the world. And they had instilled themselves in academic institutions, which is why even today, a lot of left-leaning academic institutions do teach the anti-Israel narrative. And I'll tell you, my sister was a victim of that too. She grew up in the same home that I did. She had gone to Duke. My parents were so happy. She's going to like a mostly Christian college. Maybe she'll have the same political viewpoints that our family does. But no, she took a class with a Jewish professor on the Arab-Israeli conflict for curiosity's sake. Like she just wanted to learn, right? And so what that professor did, he himself was anti-Israel. He had used books that were anti-Israel. And in those books was that false narrative, right? And so that's what they did. And so the Arabs actually were pushing back, right? So when the British were saying, because like Palestine is a region, right, that encompasses Israel and today's Jordan. And so there were Palestinian Jews and there were Palestinian Arabs. And Arabs balked at that term because Palestinian was so closely associated with Jews for thousands of years. And so even when the KGB, USSR wanted to create this national liberation movement, like a fake one. And by the way, Israel was not the only place where the USSR tried to do it. In South America, they tried to do this with another country to dismantle their system as well. And so it took a good couple of years. So 67, and then it wasn't until 69 that the term really took hold. And then, that famous saying, you repeat a lie often enough and it becomes truth. And that's where we are today.
Interesting. I appreciate you giving us that analysis. Talk to me about one or two of the big mistakes or missteps that you think Israel has taken with regard to the Palestinians. And I understand there's different groups in Gaza and the West Bank and the Bedouins, but if you could just pick out one or two that you think were really steps in the wrong direction, what would those be?
So from a critical perspective, right, because again, no country's perfect, and let's not pretend that Israel is. I know that there was, and I can understand, like from Israel's point of view, like obviously there was basically a fifth element within the country that supported enemies, and like what do you do with those people? Like after 48, they were not going to kick out the Arabs. So I know that Israel was not very much integrating the Arab population back, after 48. Like it took basically over 20 years. I mean, now of course Arabs have full rights in Israel, but I think that slow process back in the day maybe accelerated allegiances to different, anti-Israel organizations, to say the least. So I think that was one issue. And then another issue, I would say currently, it's not being steadfast enough with Jewish rights, right? Like we see with the Abraham Accords, like what did America do at the time? It said, look, Jerusalem's the capital. We're moving our embassy to the capital of Israel. And still they managed to sign agreements with the UAE, with with Bahrain, with Morocco, and other countries are about to come on board as well. So it's recognizing reality and coming from a point of strength, right? So I think that what Israel's doing now, it's playing this like little dance, especially in Judea and Samaria, right? Like, oh, like this border, that border. I think it just say like, look, Jerusalem, it's not east or west. There's one Jerusalem. This is the capital. There's no, footseeing around with this. and then going from there, right? So at least like you have that base point, and then you can talk about any other issues. I know a third issue, and this is something I hear about internally, because like I do have Arab friends. Like I know that even in Jewish communities, you know, better infrastructure could be had in some of those towns. And I know that I think in the last government under Bennett, like I think some of that was being addressed, right? Like to, um, you know, have more money like set aside for improving some of that infrastructure. But it also depends on the Arab local leaders too, right? Like, you know, are they using that money wisely? I hear both sides of it. So I think that the more Arabs are integrated, and obviously like a lot are, um, the better it is, right? But you still can't prevent everything. Like I know during Operation Breaking Dawn, we saw videos in Jaffa. Unfortunately, you know, they were basically pro Hamas rallies there with some Arabs that, you know, we've all been to Jaffa. I've been to Jaffa. You know, as a Jew, you feel perfectly safe there, and you would not think that that is where, you know, anti-Israel sentiment is. You know, like would they rather live in Gaza or would they rather have a beautiful life in Israel? So some of that's still surprising, but there's not much else Israel can do, right? Like, I mean, Israel's a democratic country, the democratically, you know, led country, and it's, you know, Arabs have a, overall like a better life in Israel than they do in most other countries. And like I saw it firsthand, like when I was in Dubai. You know, Dubai is beautiful and it's flashy, and you know everything's modern there, but there's no freedom to speak out against their government, right? Like, you know, like you can do whatever you want, but don't speak badly about the royal family. Don't get involved in politics. And in Israel, you know, Arabs have the freedom to say whatever they want. You know, pro-Israel, anti-Israel. You have an assortment there.
So, where do you see the Israeli Palestinian conflict going in terms of a solution? I mean, if you were running the ship, so to speak, in which direction would you steer it?
First of all, I don't like calling it a conflict, because a conflict is two like-minded sides. Like, so when I think of a conflict, it's like the US and Canada having a little border dispute, right? You know, as Golda Meir said, which is true, you know, if the Arabs were to put down their weapons, there would be no more war, you know? I know that Israelis don't, you know, want to have a citizen army. They do because they have to. Where do I see it going? I think Jordan needs to get involved, and it's not going to anytime soon until the king is gone. But I know that the Jordanian opposition leader came up with the Jordan option, and even Saudi Arabia recently came up with a similar version. And it's a voluntary separation, right? Like those who want to go back to Jordan, which is Palestine, like technically, right? Like even the flag looks the same. They would have that option, maybe even perhaps redrawing a few borders. I know that Netanyahu, when he was in office, he had offered to redraw some borders, but I know that the Arab mayors threw a fit over that. And where do I see it? I think ideally, and this is something that even Sisi came up with, I think back in 2014, briefly, he had said, let's develop the Sinai, right? You know, I'll give the Sinai to Israel, you know, if Israel can develop it. And then his plan was to, and of course, like not forcefully, but, you know, like those who would like to, you know, from Judea and Samaria, those Arabs can join with Gaza and have all that land in the Sinai, and then have Israel develop that financially along with any international body that wants to help. So that's one idea. Ultimately, that's it. Because you know, a two-state solution, it's anti-Semitic. Already, what happened with the Oslo Accords, we saw how detrimental that was, you know, to Israel. Like the reason there are all these problems and terrorist attacks, because you have a terrorist organization occupying 2/3 of our ancestral heartland, right? Area A and Area B. So that's not a solution at all. And it's not a sustainable one, as we unfortunately continue to see. So it's, you know, it has a lot to do with Jordan at this point.
Last question. Tell me about your vision for taking back the narrative. Where do you see this going in the next 2, 3, 5, maybe even 10 years?
So it's already going in some of the direction that I would like it to. It's to partner with existing organizations and to provide an educational, forefront, for them. Ideally, I would like to officially be a Zionism education arm of an existing organization. So that's where I see it. I also see it beyond myself, right? Like, right now I'm running it, hopefully, who knows, like maybe in 10 years, there'll be someone else at the helm and they'll grow it even more, but with the same principles and facts that are the foundation of it. So, we have a podcast, we have Zionism classes coming out. They're rolling out October 11th, called Israel Explained, through the lens of history. It covers a slew of topics. And those are topics that helped me become a Zionist, right? So again, I think there's different perspectives, right? There are people who have always been pro-Israel, and some of them tend to have a different way of talking about Israel or teaching about Israel. And then there are those who've been anti-Israel, right? Like coming from my end. And I think that it plugs in. I'm not saying one is better than the other, but I'm going more towards those who were where I was just 9, 10 years ago, right? So it's effective classes, growing on social media, growing the podcast platform. I'm having a Muslim Zionist roundtable discussion series coming up in the winter. I'm really excited about that. Strengthening ties with the Muslim Zionist community. I think that's very important to do. I think that they are the future of combating anti-Semitism. There are more Muslims than Jews in this world, and hearing their voice it's even more effective. Like I'll give you an example. So I had this great episode about the Grand Mufti featuring Ido Raif, and in it he talked about how the Grand Mufti elevated, the Dome of the Rock, elevated Al-Aqsa Mosque. He had the Dome of the Rock plated in gold when he saw that, more and more Jews were returning home, and, he took on a more anti-Semitic stance. I know that Imam Tawhidi had shared that, Jerusalem is not even mentioned in the Quran. Jerusalem's not a holy city to Muslims. So I would share that information. But when Muslims share that, it gives it a lot more credibility, right? Because it's coming from them. So I remember having conversations with Emiratis in the UAE, and they're just fascinated, right? Because like they grew up not having Israel even on the map when they were in school. And, they had confessed, they said like, no, we all thought Jews were evil and Israel was filled with, Arab killers. And, some of us didn't quite know what to make of these accords. But really quickly, especially those front-facing Emiratis that, work in the travel industry, they did this 180 and now they're genuinely very pro-Israel. I was talking to a few women who cannot wait to go to Israel, where it's just like a couple of years ago, they were against it. So I think it's that cooperation with Zionists of all backgrounds, but especially with Muslims, that is important.
Laureen, this has been a fantastic episode. Thank you so much for your time, and I wish you the best of luck.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your time.